I've spent 22 years on the bench listening to people lie to my face, but nothing prepared me for the sheer, unadulterated hubris of 3 corporate lawyers standing on my porch, demanding the deed to my family's 80-year-old homestead. The Oak Ridge Homeowners Association thought they'd bullied an isolated, ignorant old man out of the last piece of undeveloped land in the county. They didn't do their homework. They had no idea whose door they were knocking on. Stick around for this one. My grandfather bought the 5 acres at the end of Willow Creek Road in 1946. He paid for it in cash he'd saved from a mechanic's wage, back when the air out here smelled of pine needles and damp earth, not hot asphalt and chlorine. He built the 2-story fieldstone house with his own hands. I grew up running through the oak stands on this property. I know every dip in the terrain, every knot in the old porch floorboards. For decades, we were surrounded by nothing but dairy farms and open sky. Then came the developers. They arrived about 5 years ago, armed with earth movers and zoning variances. The dairy farms went bankrupt, sold out, and disappeared. In their place, the subdivision of Oak Ridge Estates crept over the rolling hills like a beige fungus. It was a sprawling, master-planned nightmare of identical vinyl-sided houses, 0 lot line yards, and young saplings tied to wooden stakes, shivering in the wind. My 5 acres suddenly became an island, a jagged, wild, unmanicured thumb sticking out in the middle of a perfectly manicured, aggressively sterile pie. I was completely surrounded by Oak Ridge Estates, but I was not part of it. My grandfather's deed predated their entire subdivision by 3/4 of a century. I owned the land, free and clear. I shared no easements, signed no covenants, and owed no dues. Legally, I was a ghost to them. Unfortunately, the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association didn't understand the law. They only understood control. It started with a letter, just a standard white envelope taped to my mailbox at the end of the dirt driveway. I opened it at my kitchen table, sipping black coffee. "Dear resident," it read, "it has come to our attention that your property is in severe violation of the Oak Ridge Estates community guidelines. Your grass exceeds the maximum allowable height of 2.5 inches. Furthermore, the rusted farm equipment visible in your side yard constitutes a neighborhood blight. Please rectify these issues within 48 hours to avoid a daily fine." I stared at the paper. The rusted farm equipment was a beautifully restored 1952 Ford tractor sitting under a lean-to. The grass was a carefully cultivated patch of native wildflowers, designed to support local bee populations. I crumpled the letter and tossed it into the wood stove. A rational person might have called the number at the bottom of the page to clear up the misunderstanding. But I've spent my entire professional life dealing with the arrogant and the entitled. When you give these people an inch of engagement, they take a mile of jurisdiction. I was a sitting circuit court judge, presiding over civil disputes down at the county courthouse. I knew exactly what this was. It was a fishing expedition. A week later, a man marched up my driveway. I was on the porch, sanding down a rocking chair. The man was in his late 40s, wearing a pastel pink polo shirt tucked tightly into khaki shorts. He carried a plastic clipboard with the kind of white-knuckled grip usually reserved for loaded weapons. "Hey, excuse me," he called out, stopping at the edge of my gravel drive. He didn't step onto the grass, probably afraid of ticks. "Are you the property owner?" I kept sanding. "Depends on who's asking. I'm Greg Davies, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." He puffed his chest out slightly. It was a subtle movement, but one I recognized from 1,000 small-time plaintiffs in my courtroom. The desperate inflation of a man who held a tiny sliver of power and wanted to wield it like a broadsword. "I left a notice on your mailbox last week. You haven't responded." "Didn't see a reason to," I said, blowing sawdust off the armrest. Greg's face flushed. The pink of his shirt seemed to climb right up his neck. "Sir, you are in blatant violation of multiple community bylaws. We've received complaints. Your property values are dragging down the entire cul-de-sac." "I don't live on a cul-de-sac, Greg," I pointed out. "I live on a private drive. Your driveway connects to Oak Ridge Boulevard. That makes you part of the community." He tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Hey, I'm issuing a formal citation. That's a $50 fine for the grass and $100 for the unregistered vehicle in the yard. If it's not paid by Friday, the fee's double." I stopped sanding. I set the block down, wiped my hands on my denim jeans, and walked to the edge of the porch. I looked down at him. "Greg," I said, my voice low and even, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I don't belong to your HOA. My land is not zoned for your subdivision. I did not sign your covenants, conditions, and restrictions. You have no legal authority over me, my land, my grass, or my tractor. Now turn around and walk back to the asphalt. If you cross that gravel line again, I will have you cited for trespassing." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. You can't do that. We have the maps. The developer assured us this entire sector falls under the association's purview. You're just a holdout. I'm a property owner with a deed from 1946, I corrected. Get off my land. He backed up a step, his eyes narrowing. You think you can just ignore the rules because you've been here a while? We have lawyers, buddy. Good ones. We'll put a lien on this dump so fast your head will spin. Good luck with that, I said, turning my back and picking up the sandpaper. I heard his golf shoes crunching on the gravel as he retreated. I knew the type. The men like Greg Davies don't back down when they are proven wrong. They double down. They weaponize bureaucracy. They surround themselves with yes-men and convince themselves that they are the absolute moral authority of their little fiefdoms. I knew it wasn't over. I just didn't realize how stupid they were actually going to be. For the next 2 months, my mailbox became a battleground of passive-aggressive stationery. The HOA sent a barrage of envelopes. First-class mail, certified mail, return receipt requested. I signed for the certified ones just to amuse myself, dumping them in a growing pile on my kitchen counter. The fines escalated with a rapid, comical absurdity. $200 for painting my front door a non-approved color. It was the same dark green it had been since 1985. $500 for unauthorized livestock because a neighbor's kid saw a stray cat sleeping on my porch. By October, according to Greg Davies's meticulous and legally void ledger, I owed the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association $14,650. I ignored all of it. I didn't write back, I didn't call. Silence is the most terrifying response you can give to a bully who thrives on reaction. But a paper tiger eventually has to show its claws. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in November. I had a rare day off from the docket and was out back, splitting firewood. The rhythmic thud of the maul hitting oak was my meditation. I heard the low, grinding rumble of a heavy diesel engine before I saw it. I lowered the maul and walked around the side of the house. A flatbed tow truck was backing up my dirt driveway. Its yellow reverse lights flashed, the warning beeper echoing off the trees. Standing near the mailbox, waving the truck backward, was Greg Davies. He was flanked by 2 men in high-vis vests. I felt a cold, sharp spike of anger, not the hot, blinding kind, but the icy, calculated fury that settles over you when a boundary is definitively crossed. I walked down the driveway, still holding the heavy wooden handle of the splitting maul in my right hand. I didn't raise it. I just let it hang loosely at my side, the heavy steel head resting against the gravel. "Cut the engine!" I shouted over the diesel roar. The truck driver, a burly guy with a thick beard, leaned out the window. He saw me, saw the maul, and hit the brakes. The truck hissed to a halt. "What the hell is going on here?" I asked, looking directly at Greg. Greg puffed up, though he kept a safe distance between us. "Enforcement action," he declared, clutching his ever-present clipboard. "Since you have refused to pay your accumulated fines, the association has voted to seize the blighted property to cover the debt. We're removing the scrap metal." He pointed a stubby finger at my grandfather's 1952 Ford tractor. "You're stealing my tractor," I clarified, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's not theft, it's a levy," Greg snapped. "We filed the paperwork. We warned you, you can't just flout the law and expect no consequences." I looked up at the tow truck driver. "Sir, what's your name?" "Jim," the driver grunted. He looked deeply uncomfortable. "Jim," I said calmly, "did this man show you a court order to seize property on this land?" Jim hesitated. He showed me a piece of paper from the Homeowners Association, said it was authorized. An HOA cannot authorize the seizure of private property without a court-ordered writ of execution, Jim. Which he doesn't have because I don't belong to his HOA, and he hasn't taken me to court. I pointed the handle of them all in the property line. If you drop that winch, you are committing grand theft auto. I will have the sheriff here in 5 minutes, and you will be leaving in handcuffs. Your company will lose its towing license by the end of the week. Now put it in drive and get off my land. Jim looked at me. He looked at Greg. Jim wasn't an idiot. He recognized the quiet, absolute authority of someone who actually knew the law versus the shrill barking of a man pretending to. Jim rolled up his window, ground the gears into drive, and pulled away, leaving Greg standing in the dust. "You can't do that," Greg shrieked, red-faced, as the truck disappeared down the road. "That was contracted by the board." "Trespass," I said softly. I took a step toward him. "You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this property, Greg." 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3. He turned and marched back to the sidewalk, his 2 high-vis companions trailing awkwardly behind him. From the safety of the public pavement, Greg turned back. "You've pushed it too far this time," he yelled. "We're not playing nice anymore. We're sending this to the firm. We'll take the land, you crazy old man. We'll take the whole damn lot." I watched him waddle away. I wasn't a crazy old man. I was a 60-year-old judge with a pristine record, a comprehensive understanding of property law, and a growing desire to absolutely demolish the Oak Ridge HOA. They wanted to send it to the firm. 2 weeks later, the firm arrived. I was sitting in my living room, reading a brief, when a sleek, black Mercedes sedan pulled up to the edge of my driveway. The doors opened, and 3 people stepped out. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in sharp, tailored suits that probably cost more than my first car. They walked with that specific, aggressive strut that junior partners adopt when they're trying to intimidate pro-CE defendants. The lead lawyer, a tall man with slick-back gray hair, carried a thick leather briefcase. They bypassed the driveway and marched straight up the front walk to my porch. I watched them through the screen door. They were walking into a trap, and they had absolutely no idea. I set my brief down, stood up, and went to my hall closet. I bypassed my usual flannel shirt. Instead, I reached into the back of the closet and pulled out the heavy, black silk robe I wore every day at the courthouse. They knocked on the door. 3 sharp, demanding raps. It was time to hold court. There is a distinct, heavy weight to a judicial robe. It is not just fabric. It is the physical manifestation of centuries of common law, draped over the shoulders of a single, flawed human being. When you zip it up, you cease to be just a man. You become the institution. I had worn this black silk for 22 years, mostly behind the polished mahogany of a courtroom bench. I had never worn it standing on the scuffed pine boards of my own front porch. I zipped it to the collar. I smoothed the pleats. I took a slow, steadying breath, letting the smell of old wood and impending storm clouds fill my lungs. Then I turned the brass knob and opened the front door. The 3 lawyers were standing in a tight, aggressive wedge. The lead attorney had his hand raised, knuckles poised to hammer on the wood a second time. He froze. His eyes dropped from my face to the black collar of the robe, down the sweeping length of the fabric, and back up to my face. The smirk that had been plastered across his sharp, expensive features evaporated into a mask of total confusion. His 2 associates, a young man with too much hair gel and a woman clutching a thick leather binder, stepped back instinctively. "Can I help you?" I asked. My voice was pitched low, the exact volume I use when a prosecutor is about to say something catastrophically stupid on the record. The lead attorney swallowed. He lowered his hand. He was trying to reconcile the rustic, weather-beaten farmhouse with the imposing figure standing in the doorway. We are looking for the property owner. We represent the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." "You found him," I said, leaning against the doorframe. I didn't invite them in. I didn't offer a smile. "State your name and your firm." It was a command, not a request. The conditioning of law school runs deep. When a man in a black robe tells you to state your name, you do it. "Charles," he stammered, pulling at his collar. "Charles Sterling from Davis Sterling and—" "I know the firm, Charles," I cut him off. "You do corporate compliance, mostly zoning loopholes and aggressive covenant enforcement. You bill out at around $400 an hour to bully people who don't know the difference between a civil complaint and a pizza menu. Who are your associates? David and Amanda, Charles said, his voice tightening. He was recovering his footing, remembering that he was standing on a porch, not in a courtroom. The arrogance began to seep back in, a slow leak of corporate bravado. Sir, I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling with the costume, but we are here to serve you with a formal notice of intent to foreclose. Amanda stepped forward, holding out a thick manila envelope. I didn't take it. I just looked at it, then looked at her until she slowly lowered her arm. Foreclose, I repeated, tasting the word. Fascinating. And on what legal basis are you foreclosing on a property that carries no mortgage, possesses no liens, and exists entirely outside of your client's platted subdivision? Charles puffed out his chest. Constructive annexation. Your driveway intersects with community-maintained roads. You utilize community infrastructure for drainage. By continuous use and proximity, you are bound by the implied covenants of the association. You owe over $14,000 in fines, and my client is exercising its right to collect. I let out a slow, gravelly laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Constructive annexation, I echoed. That is an incredibly creative legal theory, Charles. It's also complete fiction. You're citing precedent that applies to municipal annexation, not private homeowners associations. An HOA cannot absorb private, unplatted land through proximity. If they could, every gated community in this state would slowly eat the surrounding countryside like a tumor. Charles's face flushed red. We have a signed affidavit from the original developer stating this parcel was intended to be part of Phase 3. Intended, I interrupted, my voice cracking through the humid air like a whip. Intent does not transfer title. My grandfather bought this land in 1946. I hold the original deed. It is recorded in Book 42, page 118 at the county courthouse. There are no easements. There are no restrictive covenants. Your client's developer made a mistake on his master plan and sold your association a lie. And instead of doing your due diligence, you marched up to my house to threaten me. I stepped out of the doorway. I walked to the edge of the porch, the black robe catching the afternoon breeze. I looked down at the three of them. Let me explain what's going to happen now, I said, dropping the conversational tone entirely. You are going to take that envelope back to your office. You are going to look up the property records. When you realize that you just threatened to foreclose on land, you have absolutely no legal claim to, you are going to think very carefully about Rule 11 of the Rules of Civil Procedure. David, the young associate, frowned. Rule 11. Sanctions for filing frivolous claims, I clarified, staring directly into David's eyes. Because if you file that notice with the clerk, I will countersue your firm for slander of title. I will file a grievance with the State Bar for unethical conduct. I will drag you through a discovery process so exhaustive and miserable, you will forget what your own families look like. Charles sneered. You think you can intimidate us? You're just a stubborn old man playing dress-up. We have the resources of a 300-home community behind us. We will bury you in paperwork. I stopped. I let the silence hang there. A crow cawed in the distance. The wind rustled the dry oak leaves above us. My name is Arthur Mitchell, I said quietly. Charles blinked. The name didn't register at first, but Amanda, the quiet associate with the binder, suddenly went completely pale. Her mouth dropped open. She aggressively tugged on Charles's sleeve. Charles, she whispered, her voice trembling. Charles, shut up. What? He snapped. Look at him, she hissed, her eyes wide with absolute terror. Arthur Mitchell, the Honorable Arthur Mitchell, he's the presiding judge of the Fourth Circuit. Charles froze. The color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might faint right there on my grandfather's porch. The Fourth Circuit, the very court where any foreclosure action, any property dispute, and any civil lawsuit in this county would have to be filed. Your Honor, Charles choked out, the arrogance vanishing, replaced by a raw, suffocating panic. You have 5 seconds to get off my property, I said, before I hold you in contempt of common sense. They didn't walk. They practically ran. The silence that settled over the property after the Mercedes tore out of my driveway was heavy, but it wasn't peaceful. I took off the robe, draped it over the back of the rocking chair, and poured myself a glass of bourbon. I drank it neat, staring out at the rusted Ford tractor. I had won the skirmish. I knew that. Charles and his associates were currently hyperventilating in the leather seats of their sedan, frantically drafting an apology email to their managing partner. But I also knew the machinery of corporate stupidity. Men like Greg Davies, the HOA president, do not possess the capacity for self-reflection. When faced with an immovable object, they do not retreat. They blindly accelerate. The next morning I drove into town. I didn't go to my chambers. I went straight to the county clerk's office on the first floor of the courthouse. The clerk, a sharp-witted woman named Helen, who had worked there longer than I had been on the bench, looked up from her computer. "Morning, Judge," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "You're on the wrong floor. Docket doesn't start until 10. "I'm here as a citizen today, Helen," I replied, sliding a slip of paper across the counter with my parcel identification number on it. "Do me a favor. Pull the title history on my Willow Creek property. Check for any filings in the last 48 hours. Helen raised an eyebrow, but typed the numbers into her terminal. Her keyboard clacked rhythmically. A moment later, she stopped. She squinted at the screen, leaned in closer, and let out a low whistle. "Well, Arthur," she murmured, "it looks like you've got a cloud on your title." My jaw tightened. "What kind of cloud?" "A mechanics and material men's lien," she read aloud. "Filed yesterday afternoon at 4:00 p.m. The claimant is the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The amount is $14,650 for unpaid community assessments and property remediation." I closed my eyes. The sheer, blinding arrogance of it. Charles and his firm hadn't filed it. They were too smart for that. They had come to serve me the warning. But Greg Davies, impatient and power-hungry, had bypassed his own legal counsel. He had marched down to the courthouse himself, filled out a boilerplate form he probably downloaded off the internet, and filed a fraudulent lien against my property under the perjury penalty. He had actually done it. "Helen," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "print that out for me, with the timestamp and the signature." She handed the warm paper over the counter. There it was, Greg Davies' signature, messy and rushed, sitting at the bottom of a document that effectively tied up my family's land. With that lien in place, I couldn't sell the property. I couldn't borrow against it, and it technically sat as a massive, glaring red flag on my credit. Filing a false lien is not just a procedural error. In this state, it is a felony. It is a direct attack on a person's livelihood and legacy. It is called slander of title, and it carries heavy statutory damages. I walked out of the clerk's office with the paper folded in my breast pocket. I didn't go to my courtroom. I walked 2 blocks down Main Street to a small, unassuming brick building, tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. The brass plaque on the door read, "Thomas Gable, attorney at law." Thomas and I had gone to law school together. While I had pursued the bench, seeking the quiet order of arbitration, Thomas had become a litigator. Not just any litigator. He was a ruthless, terrifyingly effective real estate attorney. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't just beat you in court. He salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. I walked past his secretary and pushed open the door to his office. Thomas was leaning back in his chair, boots up on his desk, reading a deposition. He looked up, surprised. "Arthur," he said, taking his boots off the desk. "You're supposed to be in a robe, glaring at poor people." "I need to hire you," I said, dropping the printed lien on his desk. Thomas picked it up. He read it once. Then he read it again. A slow, wicked grin spread across his face. It was the smile of a shark smelling blood in the water. "Tell me," Thomas said softly, "that some idiot HOA president actually filed a fraudulent lien on the private property of a sitting circuit court judge." "He did. Did he have counsel review it?" "If he did, they're accomplices, but I suspect he went rogue." I pulled up a chair and sat down, resting my hands on my knees. "Thomas, I want them dismantled. I don't just want the lien removed. I want a civil suit for slander of title, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and trespass. I want to subpoena every email, every text message, and every board meeting minute the Oak Ridge HOA has produced in the last 5 years. I want to know where every penny of their dues goes." Thomas picked up a pen and began twirling it through his fingers. "Arthur, you realize that if we go nuclear, This board will bankrupt the association, trying to defend themselves. The residents will be left holding the bag for the legal fees. The residents voted these tyrants into power, I said, my voice hardening. They let a beige fungus grow over the dairy farms, and they allowed men like Greg Davies to wield power over their lives. That's the cost of apathy. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the smell of pine pitch and the rough stone of the chimney he built by hand. I thought about the developers who would scrape the earth bare just to build cheap boxes. My grandfather bought that dirt with blood and grease, I said quietly. They want to take it for a lawn citation. I am going to make them bleed. Thomas chuckled. He opened a fresh legal pad. All right, Judge, Thomas said, uncapping his pen. Let's go hunting. Lawsuits do not explode. They grind. If you watch television, you might think the legal system is a series of dramatic courtroom shouting matches that resolve in 45 minutes. The reality is far more punishing. The justice system is a massive, indifferent machine fueled by printer ink, billable hours, and anxiety. When you feed someone into that machine, it doesn't bite their head off. It slowly crushes them in a vise of manila folders and certified mail. Thomas Gable drafted the complaint in 3 days. It was a masterpiece of aggressive civil litigation. We weren't just suing the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association for slander of title. Thomas added counts for intentional infliction of emotional distress, harassment, and civil conspiracy. More importantly, he didn't just sue the entity. He named Greg Davies individually. Corporate shields are great for negligence, Thomas had explained to me over a plate of ribs at a local diner, tapping a barbecue-stained finger on the draft. If a board member makes an honest mistake, the HOA's liability insurance covers it, but fraud, malicious filing of a false instrument, insurance policies specifically exclude intentional torts. Greg stepped outside the protection of the board when he marched down to the courthouse and lied under oath. We're going for his personal bank accounts, Arthur. I authorized the filing. I paid the retainer out of my grandfather's old savings account. It felt poetic. We didn't just mail the summons. Thomas hired a private process server named Dave, a retired state trooper who looked like a walking cinder block. Dave had a gift for theatrical timing. The Oak Ridge HOA held its monthly meetings on the first Tuesday of the month at the community clubhouse. It was a sterile, overly air-conditioned room smelling of generic glass cleaner and stale coffee. I wasn't there, of course, but the discovery process later provided me with a perfect, high-definition recording of the event, courtesy of the neighborhood's own minutes-keeping protocol. Greg was at the podium, wearing a navy blazer, addressing a crowd of about 30 bored homeowners. He was in the middle of a power trip about the acceptable shades of beige for exterior trim. Dave walked in through the double doors at the back. He didn't wait in line. He didn't sit down. He walked straight down the center aisle, his heavy boots thudding against the cheap commercial carpet. The room fell silent. Greg stopped mid-sentence, glaring at the interruption. "Excuse me," Greg barked, tapping his microphone. "This is a closed meeting for residents only. You need to leave." Dave reached the podium. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his jacket. "Gregory Davies?" Dave asked. His voice boomed through the quiet room without the need for a microphone. "Yes, who are you?" "You've been served," Dave said. He slapped the stack of papers onto the podium, right on top of Greg's color swatches. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Dave turned around and walked out, leaving the doors swinging behind him. The camera angle captured Greg's face perfectly. He looked down at the top sheet. Arthur Mitchell versus Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, et al. He saw the phrase slander of title. He saw the damages requested, statutory penalties, punitive damages, and attorney's fees totaling well over $250,000. The blood drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just swallowed a golf ball. The neighborhood meeting erupted into a chorus of confused, angry murmurs. That was just the opening salvo. Once a lawsuit is filed, the discovery phase begins. This is where the real bleeding happens. Thomas issued a subpoena ducis tecum, demanding every single piece of paper, email, text message and financial record the Oak Ridge HOA had generated in the last 60 months. Their legal counsel, Charles's firm, who had desperately tried to drop them as clients, but were forced to stay on by the state bar until new counsel could be secured, fought the subpoena. They filed motions to quash, calling our demands overly broad and burdensome. Thomas and I went to the motion hearing. I didn't wear my robe. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a sharp gray suit. The judge presiding over the case was an old colleague of mine, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Carter. She took one look at the fraudulent lien Greg had filed, looked down at Charles, and denied his motion to quash entirely. "Turn it over, counselor," Judge Carter had ordered, her gavel coming down with finality. Every last sticky note. The documents arrived at Thomas's office 2 weeks later, 7 bankers' boxes full of them, alongside 3 thumb drives of digital data. I spent my evenings sitting in Thomas's conference room, drinking black coffee and reading through the inner workings of the Oak Ridge HOA. It was a terrifying look into the psychology of petty tyrants. We found emails where Greg bragged to other board members about targeting specific residents he didn't like. We found text messages coordinating harassment campaigns against a single mother because her toddler's plastic slide was visible from the street. But the smoking gun was an email thread dated 2 days before Greg filed the lien. It was between Greg and Charles. Greg had emailed the firm, demanding they foreclose on my property immediately. Charles, to his meager credit, had replied with a stark warning. "Greg," the email read, "we cannot proceed with foreclosure or place a lien on the Mitchell property. We have reviewed the county records. Mitchell is correct. His land is unencumbered and outside the HOA's legal jurisdiction. Do not initiate any collection actions against this property. Doing so would constitute a fraudulent filing." Greg had replied 10 minutes later, "You guys are gutless. I'll do it myself." I sat back in my chair, holding the printed email. Outside the window, the streetlights of town flickered on. "He ignored his own counsel," I said softly. Thomas looked up from a ledger. He smiled. He knew it was fraudulent. He was explicitly told it was illegal, and he did it anyway to prove a point. "Arthur, this isn't just negligence anymore. This is malice aforethought. The insurance company is going to drop them the second they see this." "He dug his own grave," I murmured. "Yes," Thomas said, clicking his pen. "And tomorrow morning we push him in." A deposition room is designed to be uncomfortable. The chairs are slightly too rigid. The fluorescent lights hum with a low, headache-inducing frequency. The air conditioning is always set 3 degrees too cold. It is a space built to strip away comfort and leave a witness feeling exposed, isolated, and vulnerable. We rented a conference room in a neutral office park for the occasion. The court reporter, a quiet woman with lightning-fast fingers, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, setting up her stenotype machine. I sat next to Thomas. I wore a dark suit, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded on the table. I didn't bring any notes. I was there for one reason: intimidation. I wanted Greg to look across the table and see the man whose land he had tried to steal. Greg arrived 10 minutes late. He didn't look like the puffed-up dictator who had marched onto my property in a pink polo shirt. He wore an ill-fitting gray suit. His skin had a sallow gray tint to it, and he had dark circles under his eyes. The weight of the impending litigation was crushing him. He was accompanied by his new lawyer, a frantic-looking man named Caldwell. Charles's firm had finally managed to recuse themselves, citing a breakdown in the attorney-client relationship. Caldwell looked like he had been hired out of the Yellow Pages 2 days prior. They sat down. Greg refused to make eye contact with me. He stared fixedly at the yellow legal pad in front of him. "Let's go on the record," Thomas said, his voice smooth and dangerous. The court reporter nodded. Thomas started with the basics: name, address, position on the board. He spent the first hour lulling Greg into a false sense of security, asking mundane questions about neighborhood bylaws and grass heights. Greg's confidence slowly started to return. He began to puff his chest out again, giving long, rambling answers about the importance of community standards. I just watched him. I didn't blink. "Mr. Davies," Thomas said, shifting gears seamlessly. Let's talk about November 12th, the day you filed a mechanics and materialman's lien against my client's property. Greg shifted in his seat. The leather squeaked loudly in the quiet room. Yes. Did you draft that lien yourself? I used a standard form, Greg said defensively. Approved by the board. Did the board vote to authorize the filing of that specific lien? Thomas asked. Caldwell leaned in. Objection, relevance. He's the president of the board, Thomas countered flatly. It goes directly to liability. You can answer the question, Greg. Greg swallowed. We had a general consensus that delinquent accounts needed to be handled aggressively. That wasn't my question, Thomas said, leaning forward. Did the board vote to place a lien on Arthur Mitchell's property? Yes or no? Greg looked at Caldwell, who gave a tiny, helpless shrug. No, Greg muttered. There wasn't a formal vote. I acted in my executive capacity. I see. Thomas reached into his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. Mr. Davies, please identify Exhibit D. Greg looked at the paper. It was the email thread between him and Charles. The sweat broke out on his forehead almost instantly. A single bead rolled down his temple. It's an email, Greg stammered. Read the highlighted portion out loud, please. Greg's hand shook as he picked up the paper. It says, do not initiate any collection actions against this property. Doing so would constitute a fraudulent filing. And who wrote that? Charles, the HOA attorney. And what was your response, Mr. Davies? Silence stretched over the room. The only sound was the clicking of the court reporter's machine. Read it, Greg, Thomas commanded. The false warmth was entirely gone from his voice. You guys are gutless. I'll do it myself, Greg whispered. So, Thomas said, folding his hands. You were explicitly advised by legal counsel that placing a lien on Mr. Mitchell's property would be fraudulent. You acknowledged that advice, insulted your attorney, and then went to the courthouse and swore under penalty of perjury that you had a valid claim to his land. Is that correct? I thought he was wrong, Greg blurted out, his voice cracking. I thought Charles was just being a coward. The map showed the driveway. The map is not the deed, Mr. Davies, Thomas interrupted, his voice dropping to a low growl. Did you ever pull the deed? No. Did you ever check the property lines at the county surveyor's office? No. So you just guessed. I was protecting the community, Greg yelled, slamming his hand on the table. He was making the whole neighborhood look like a junkyard. He thinks he's better than us just because he's a judge. He's a menace. I finally spoke. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany. The room instantly froze. Even Caldwell stopped breathing. I am not a menace, Greg, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the bench. I am a man who was left alone. You came onto my land. You tried to steal my grandfather's tractor. You tried to steal my title. You did it not because you cared about the community, but because you couldn't stand the fact that there was a piece of the world you couldn't control. Greg stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. The bluster was gone. He looked completely, utterly broken. Mr. Caldwell, Thomas said, turning to Greg's lawyer. I'm going to formally notify you right now that based on this testimony, we will be petitioning the court to pierce the corporate veil. We will argue that Mr. Davies acted maliciously and outside the scope of his duties. When we win this lawsuit, the HOA's insurance policy will not pay out. Greg will be personally liable for the full amount. Caldwell slowly turned to look at his client. Greg slumped back in his chair. The reality of his situation had finally breached the thick walls of his arrogance. He was going to lose his house. He was going to lose his savings. He was going to lose everything, all because he couldn't stand the sight of wildflowers and a 1952 Ford tractor. Deposition concluded, Thomas said, closing his folder. We walked out of the office park and into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt cleaner out here. You think they'll settle? I asked, putting on my sunglasses. Thomas unlocked his car. Oh, they'll try. But I think we're going to make them bleed a little more first. The collapse of a neighborhood dictatorship is rarely a quiet affair. It happens loudly, messily, and usually involves a lot of pointed fingers. 2 days after the deposition, Caldwell called Thomas. He offered $50,000 to drop the suit entirely. Thomas laughed so hard he had to put his desk phone on speaker just to share the joke with his paralegal, before hanging up without issuing a counteroffer. The panic began to seep into Oak Ridge Estates like contaminated groundwater. The HOA board members, realizing that Greg had effectively voided their directors' and officers' liability insurance by committing intentional, documented fraud, started jumping ship. They resigned en masse, fleeing the blast radius. Suddenly, the pristine, beige community was left with a massive legal bill, zero leadership, and the terrifying realization that their monthly association dues were about to skyrocket just to cover the punitive damages. The neighborhood revolted. I didn't attend the emergency community meeting, but Thomas got a copy of the minutes and the audio recording. It was a bloodbath. 200 angry homeowners packed into the local middle school gymnasium, the air thick with the smell of cheap floor wax and pure, unadulterated outrage. They screamed at Greg. They demanded to know why their property values were suddenly hanging by a thread over a patch of wildflowers and a vintage piece of farm equipment. They realized, far too late, that the monster they had empowered to enforce their trivial, aesthetic rules was now going to bankrupt them. Oh, the very people who had once cheered Greg for keeping the neighborhood uniform were now demanding his head on a platter. Greg tried to defend himself at the microphone. He tried to claim he was protecting their investments. He was aggressively booed off the stage. By Friday morning, Caldwell was back on the phone with Thomas. This time he wasn't offering a lowball settlement. He was begging for terms. We didn't go to trial, we didn't need to. The threat of a public, drawn-out court battle that would financially ruin the subdivision was more than enough to force their hand. But I wasn't interested in simply taking their money and walking away. I wanted a permanent, structural surrender. We met in Judge Carter's chambers to finalize the agreement. Greg sat in the far corner of the room, looking 10 years older than he had on my driveway. He didn't speak. He just stared blankly at the patterned carpet. Thomas laid out the terms. It was a masterclass in punitive restitution. First, the fraudulent lien was immediately dissolved, accompanied by a formal, public apology filed into the county record, acknowledging that the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association had absolutely no jurisdiction over my grandfather's land. Second, they paid all of my legal fees. Every single billable hour Thomas had racked up was covered by the HOA's Emergency Reserve Fund, draining it down to the studs. Third, the financial settlement. We agreed to a lump sum of $150,000, but we didn't just take the cash. Thomas drafted an ironclad, perpetual buffer covenant. The HOA was legally forced to plant and maintain a dense 50-foot tree line on their side of the property boundary, completely obscuring their vinyl-sided nightmare from my view. They paid for the mature trees. They paid for the landscaping, and they signed an agreement that any future encroachment, even a stray blade of grass crossing the property line, would result in automatic, ruinous financial penalties. Finally, there was Greg. He was forced to pay $25,000 out of his own pocket to settle the personal liability claim for slander of title. It wiped out his savings. He signed the paperwork with a trembling hand. The ink was barely dry before he put his house on the market. He couldn't afford to live there anymore, and even if he could, his neighbors despised him. The man who had tried to dictate the color of everyone's front door was effectively exiled from his own kingdom. I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon feeling a strange, heavy sense of finality. The war was over. The siege had been broken. A month later, the settlement check cleared. I didn't invest it in the stock market. I didn't buy a new truck. I took the money and hired a crew of local craftsmen. They spent 6 weeks working on my property. They tore down the rotting lean-to that had sheltered the tractor and built a massive, beautiful post and beam barn. They used rough sawn oak, exactly like my grandfather would have wanted. They poured a flawless concrete floor, installed proper lighting, and built heavy sliding doors that locked with a satisfying metallic thud. When it was finished, I fired up the 1952 Ford. The old engine sputtered, caught, and settled into a rhythmic, rumbling idle. The smell of diesel exhaust mingled with the scent of fresh-cut oak and damp earth. I drove the tractor into the center of the new barn, cut the engine, and just sat there, on the vinyl seat for a long time, listening to the hot metal tick as it cooled down. Outside, beyond the property line, the landscape contractors hired by the HOA were busy planting a wall of evergreen trees. The beige houses were slowly disappearing behind a screen of deep, natural green. The chaotic, manicured noise of Oak Ridge Estates was being muted, walled off entirely from the quiet dignity of a farm that had stood its ground. My grandfather wasn't an educated man. He didn't understand the intricacies of property law, implied covenants, or civil procedure. He was a mechanic who came home every night, with grease permanently stained into the calluses of his hands. He saved crumpled dollar bills in a coffee tin until he had enough to buy this dirt. But he understood permanence. He understood that when you own a piece of the earth, you defend it. You dig your heels in. You don't let men with clipboards, pink shirts, and synthetic authority tell you what your legacy is worth. And you certainly don't let them take it from you just because it ruins their view. I walked out of the barn and up the dirt driveway. I stopped at the edge of the road, looking at the exact spot where Greg had stood with the tow truck driver. There was no trace of them left, just the gravel, the dirt, and the wild, overgrown grass swaying in the evening breeze. I went back up to the porch, sat down in the rocking chair I had finished sanding months ago, and watched the sun dip below the tree line. The land was quiet. The deed was clean. The robe was hanging in the closet, and the grass was exactly as tall, but they're tall as I wanted it to be. That is how you handle a bully. You don't just fight back, you dismantle the very foundation of their false authority. My grandfather's land remains untouched. The tractor is shining under a newly restored barn roof, and the Oak Ridge HOA learned a very expensive lesson in property law. If you enjoyed watching a neighborhood tyrant face the ultimate legal reality check, hit that like button, share this video with anyone suffering under an overstepping HOA, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice served. Never let them push you off your own porch.